I'm Michelle Martin, and this is Tell Me More from NPR News. Last night, President Obama announced what many observers are calling the most consequential decision of his presidency to date, what he plans to do about Afghanistan. He announced a dramatic increase of 30,000 U.S. troops on the ground and an equally tight timeline for their departure in July of 2011. It was a serious and businesslike speech, and the president made no effort to downplay the scope of the task.
Now, let me be clear. None of this will be easy. The struggle against violent extremism will not be finished quickly, and it extends well beyond Afghanistan and Pakistan. It will be an enduring test of our free society and our leadership in the world. And unlike the great power conflicts and clear lines of division that defined the 20th century, our effort will involve disorderly regions, failed states, diffuse enemies.
The additional troops are scheduled to begin deploying as early as next month and will bring the total number of U.S. service members in Afghanistan to more than 100,000. More than 900 Americans have been killed during the war in Afghanistan to date. Almost 300 have died this year alone. Throughout the day, NPR is bringing you different points of view about the president's decision. Later, we'll hear from two journalists who've been following the president's decision-making process, Abdurrahim Fukara of Al Jazeera International and Pam Gentry of Black Entertainment Television. But first, we decided to reach out to three people with very different backgrounds, but all with deep experience in and around Afghanistan and on the ground in Afghanistan. Ashraf Haidari is political counselor at the Embassy of Afghanistan in Washington, D.C. Journalist Najib Sharifi worked with NPR in Afghanistan. He's now pursuing postgraduate journalism studies in the Washington, D.C. area. We're also joined by Captain Benjamin Tupper, who spent 12 months embedded with the Afghan National Army. He's the author of Welcome to Afghanistan, Send More Ammo. He joins us from member station WAER in Syracuse, New York, and I thank you all so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Now, first, I'm going to start with you, Mr. Haidari. In fact, I'm going to ask each of you this question. The president did not paint a terribly encouraging picture of circumstances in Afghanistan right now. In fact, let's play a short clip of what he said last night.
Afghanistan is not lost, but for several years it has moved backwards. There's no imminent threat of the government being overthrown, but the Taliban has gained momentum. Al-Qaeda has not reemerged in Afghanistan in the same numbers as before 9/11, but they retain their safe havens along the border. And our forces lack the full support they need to effectively train and partner with Afghan security forces and better secure the population.
Mr. Haidari, do you agree with his assessment?
Of course, yes, I completely agree with the president's very accurate explanation of the current situation in Afghanistan, that, of course, the Afghan government is present in Kabul and most of the provincial centers across the country, but that doesn't mean that we are effectively delivering basic services to people in terms of rule of law and governance, and particularly security in the south and east of Afghanistan, where the Taliban have been resurgent over the past at least 5 years, as the president, I think, also discussed, and I think part of his speech, that Afghanistan was neglected because of course, the situation in Iraq. So we are in control in Afghanistan, but of course, we need to accelerate the process of state building in Afghanistan. Not only, of course, building the security institutions, but also strengthening governance institutions.
The bottom line, though, the president said that this Afghanistan is in danger of becoming a failed state and a host for Al-Qaeda. Do you think that's fair? Is that a fair assessment?
I think I could agree that Afghanistan could be a potentially failed state if it were not for the presence of the international security forces. So that's why we need to accelerate the process of strengthening state structures in Afghanistan, both security and civilian institutions, so that we increasingly stand on our own to deliver the peace dividend that the people of Afghanistan have expected.
Najib, do you agree with the president's assessment of circumstances there?
Yes, I do agree with the president's assessment. Well, we understand that Taliban cannot pose an imminent threat to overthrow the government, but we need to make all possible efforts to stop from the progress of the Taliban. And we should keep in mind that today the Taliban are much more violent than when they were ruling, and at any time they come back, God forbid. they will be much more violent than the time they were ruling. This is because they bled a lot during the past 7 years. During the time that their regime was being overthrown, thousands of them died. This has increased the clashes that existed between the Mujahideen fighters and the Taliban when they were fighting back in the 1990s and early 2000s. And at the same time, today we see that thousands and thousands of people were working for American or international institutes or organizations, UN, embassies. So what will happen to the fate of all of these people? And
it's interesting because you and I have spoken previously on the program, and at the time, if I'm remembering correctly, you were critical of the troop presence. You thought it was just stimulating more resistance, in essence. Well, what do you think now? What do you think of the president's proposal to add yet more troop presence, even for a limited time?
Well, I remember very well that 2 months ago that I do not agree with the policy of increasing troops, because by that we cannot achieve a lot. But today I can say that I support the policy of increasing the troops, and that's because within the past 2 months, as I said earlier, we need to keep the morale up, and this is basically a message for the Taliban that be patient and hopeful.
And wait it out. Interesting. Captain Tupper, let's hear from you. First of all, do you agree with the president's assessment of the facts now, and what do you think of his proposal?
Yes, as a blanket statement, yes, I think he was on target and accurate. And I would agree with the comments that your guests have made also. I'd throw in this caveat. Is the government in Kabul at risk of being overthrown? No. I don't see that happening for years. But I don't know if that's really the standard we should measure things by. We have a figurehead government. It's got a lot of issues, as shown most recently in the elections with the fraud. But where I was, and I think where a lot of people who are down in the weeds, in the outer provinces and remote district centers, that's where you see really where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, where you see the Taliban in control. And by that I mean there are established government agencies, district centers, police, etc. But when the population has disputes, at least in the area I served, which was mostly eastern Afghanistan, Ghazni and Paktika provinces, when the general population had problems, if they went to the government officials, they were asked to pay bribes. They were asked to, give up things to get something. So they started slowly but surely going to these, we'll call the shadow government, shadow district centers, whatever label you want to put it, run by the Taliban. Because frankly, one of the things that I can say positive about the Taliban is they don't seem to be as interested in bribes on these lower levels. I'm not saying I'd prefer to see them in authority. They come with a lot of baggage. But yes, there's a government in Kabul. No, it's not at risk of being overthrown or overrun. But to me, that's only part of the measure. Down in the little district centers, you see the Taliban has more influence, and the people look to them more as a maybe fair governing body than the actual government itself. And I think therein lies the big problem we face in Afghanistan.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, sir.
No, I'm going to want to hear from Mr. Haidari about the corruption issue, but I want to hear from you because you've talked a lot about this in your writings and when you've been asked about this before. Do you think that, the president's making three arguments. He's saying that there's a vital national security interest for the United States. That's thing one. Thing two, that we need more troops in order to give the institutions in Afghanistan, both the security forces and the civilian government, time to get stronger. And that the third, that it is fixable. And so on the corruption question, is it fixable in the timeline that the president's laid out?